Welcome back to the deep dive. We're here to take that stack of sources you sent us, all the articles, the research, the data, and really synthesize it. We cut through all the academic noise to deliver those aha moments that help explain how the world works. Today, we're diving into one of the most powerful and often, invisible forces that shapes who we are, the educational system.
Right.
And I want to start with a question for you, our listener. Go beyond just what gender were my teachers. I want you to really think back. Did you ever stop and consider that the very layout of the school building, the rules for the bathrooms, the locker rooms, even the dress code, that this was one of the first and most powerful lessons you ever got about gender?
That's exactly it. That is the core of what we're getting into today.
Yeah.
We're looking at how educational institutions are. Well, they're a fundamental agent of socialization. They teach us codified knowledge, of course, but maybe even more importantly, they regulate our gender-normative ideologies and our behaviors.
So they're guiding our thought.
They're guiding our thoughts, our actions, our expectations. And a lot of the time it's so subtle, happening both inside and outside the actual classroom.
So our mission today is, frankly, pretty ambitious. We need to summarize this whole intricate and, let's be honest, often frustrating process of gender socialization in schools. Then we have to assess the consequences of all this institutional bias, which, as we'll see, shows up in some really stunning statistics.
And then, after all that, we pivot. We're going to outline the historical and the current interventions that are actually driving social change. The source material you gave us is going to be our map for all of this.
Right. To navigate that map, we need what we call our learner's toolkit. Just a few key terms.
First up, agents of socialization. These are just the ways we learn how to act in society. Think family, peers, the media, and for our purposes today, education.
And the next concept is probably the one doing the most work in our sources today. It's the hidden curriculum.
Yes. This is all the stuff that isn't explicitly taught. It's the subtle, informal lessons you just absorb by being in the system. Gender stereotypes, cultural expectations, power dynamics, all of it.
We'll also hit on implicit bias.
Which is that unintentional belief or expression of bias. It seeps into the decisions that teachers and administrators make, often without them even realizing it.
And finally, credentialism.
Which is just the sociological term for the importance our society puts on formal certifications, like diplomas and degrees, as the main symbols of what you know and what you're qualified to do.
Okay, so with that toolkit, I think we're ready to start. All right, let's unpack this dual reality of school. On the one hand, yeah, it teaches you practical skills, history, physics, maybe even how to fix a leaky faucet in shop class.
Right, the explicit curriculum.
But at the very same time, it's socializing us into societal norms, how to be patient, how to wait your turn in line when it's okay to raise your hand. It's a mechanism for societal regulation.
And that regulation starts the second you walk through the door. It extends right down to the physical, gendered infrastructure of the building itself.
And this is where it gets really complex, and it's something I think most cisgender students just never have to think about. I'm talking about the immediate physical experience of using gendered bathrooms and locker rooms. The sources point out that when a school rigidly enforces that male-female binary, it creates this incredibly difficult personal choice for any student who's intersex or gender neutral.
Every single trip to the restroom becomes a negotiation of their identity versus the institution's demand for compliance.
That's a profound way to put it. The building itself is enforcing a specific worldview.
And it goes beyond the bathrooms. You see this regulation so clearly in dress codes.
Right.
These codes are often designed to make sure a student's appearance, their clothes, their hair lines up with the school's idea of their biological status, and that often completely overrides how the student actually expresses their own gender.
And these have been challenged in court, right? Because they are often just structurally unfair.
Rigorously challenged.
I was really struck by that 2014 case in Indiana. A federal appeals court struck down a high school rule. It said male basketball players had to keep their hair short above the ears and collar.
But there was no similar rule for the girls on the team.
None at all.
And that legal finding is so important because it gets at that structural inequity. Dress codes so often restrict what girls can wear. No midriffs, skirts have to be a certain length, but there are no similar sort of gender parallel rules for boys.
The argument being that these rules police or sexualize female bodies in a way that they just don't for male students.
Exactly. And that says so much about the gendered expectations that are just baked right into the system.
Wait, this is all connected to that big Supreme Court case, isn't it? Tinker v. Des Moines?
It is. The legal precedent goes all the way back to 1968. That's the ruling that established that students don't, quote, shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate. And that precedent is the foundation for almost every challenge today against arbitrary, gender-discriminatory rules about how you can present yourself.
So we're not just talking about an inconvenience. We're talking about fundamental rights and dignity being regulated by a hairstyle. And it goes beyond gender identity.
Oh, absolutely. These policies on physical presentation, especially hair rules, are constantly being challenged because they inherently discriminate against students who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color.
The source material had that incredible story about the Texas school. A Native American kindergartner suspended for having long hair, which is traditional in his culture.
And that lawsuit was so smart. It didn't just argue simple discrimination. It used a religious freedom argument.
Which ended up working.
It did. The case was settled on the grounds that the school had to accommodate religious beliefs in its dress code. It equated his right to wear traditional braids with, say, a Catholic student's right to wear a rosary or a Jewish student's right to wear a yarmulke.
That is a huge finding. It shows these rules are so much more than just administrative fluff. They intersect with these deep cultural and religious rights.
And we see that again and again, even with religious attire like the hijab worn by Muslim women. Courts have consistently upheld their right to wear religious coverings, even during school sports.
So the rules are always in flux.
Constantly. It's this complex mix of federal law, state policy, and local interpretation. It's frankly confusing for everyone involved.
Okay, let's move past the explicit rules for a second and get to the real engine of this whole thing. The hidden curriculum in action. This is where those subtle, informal lessons really shape us.
And one of the most, I'd say, insidious but scientifically documented effects is something called the attention gap.
The attention gap.
Research consistently shows that boys get way more attention in the classroom. And it's not just negative attention for being disruptive. It's positive feedback. It's general engagement from the teacher.
And that has a real-world consequence.
A direct one. This attention gap is directly correlated with lower math scores for girls. It strongly suggests that it's the institutional practice, not some kind of innate ability, that's creating that performance gap.
That is startling. A girl's performance can suffer just because a teacher, through implicit bias, is unconsciously calling on the boys more often.
And this differential treatment continues with how behavior is labeled. The sources note that boys' behavior is overwhelmingly seen as more disruptive in a classroom setting.
Which is a perception, but it has tangible results.
Lifelong consequences.
Yeah.
It leads to a disproportionate referral of boys to special education services.
Okay, let's pause on that. I want to slow down here because the numbers are really stark. Can you just repeat those specific data points?
Of course. For students who are identified with learning disabilities, or LD, 73% are male.
73%.
And for students identified with emotional disabilities, or ED, that number jumps even higher. It's 76% male. So we are essentially talking about the school system pathologizing behavior. Behavior that maybe falls outside a certain, you could say, feminized ideal of classroom composure.
Yeah.
And it's diagnosing it as a formal disability in boys at 3 times the rate of girls.
That is a huge finding about how we regulate masculinity in schools.
Huge.
It seems like the hidden curriculum affects how students are taught, but also what they see or don't see in their books. Which brings us to textbook annihilation.
Yes, the perpetuation of norms through what material gets chosen. If you look at a lot of textbooks, especially in social studies or literature, many of them still primarily feature families that are heteronormative, racially similar, and non-disabled.
So other family structures are just invisible.
Exactly. This systemic invisibility of racially diverse families, families with disabilities, non-heteronormative families, that is what sociologists call symbolic annihilation. The curriculum is sending a powerful message that certain identities just aren't normal, or maybe don't even exist.
And this isn't just a K-12 problem. The sources had a really compelling example of how this hidden curriculum works even in professional training, specifically medical school.
The medical school example it's chillingly precise. One study found that the curriculum's focus on women's health explicitly excluded male students from learning how to do gynecological exams. The rationale was that it was a female concern.
So the male students are missing critical skills, but the female students were facing a different kind of barrier.
A totally different kind. They faced implicit exclusion. It wasn't formal policy. It was modeling. It was casual comments from professors.
Like what?
Things about choosing female-friendly career paths or comments about how motherhood would negatively impact a medical career. It just shows that the hidden curriculum isn't just what you're taught, but what the institution subtly tells you your limits are, even in the most elite environments.
Okay, let's transition from those subtle classroom dynamics to the lifelong impact of career choices. I want you, the listener, to just reflect for a second on the gender balance you saw in your own AP classes, or maybe the vocational tracks at your high school. Did you ever notice an unconscious steering of students?
That steering is the direct result of something called gender tracking, and its roots are deep. They're historical, built right into the very purpose of public education.
Let's get into that history. Since the mid-1800s, education for women was deliberately steered toward jobs that were considered gender normative, teaching, nursing, secretarial work.
While at the same time, advanced math, science, engineering, those are often framed as being only for men.
And this wasn't just a suggestion, it was structural.
Completely structural. Academic tracking starts really subtly in elementary school grouping kids by how well they seem to be doing. Well, but it gets very concrete in high school through counseling and course selection.
Right. You're put on the college-bound track or the trade school track.
And the underlying gender stereotypes from counselors and teachers heavily influence those early decisions.
So how do you fight back against a mechanism that's so deep-rooted, a system that essentially tells you, based on your gender, which jobs are for you?
The intervention has to be about profound, diverse representation. It's that simple and that hard. We have to intentionally show students varied professionals across all fields and all demographics.
So when a student sees a woman who is a successful engineer or a man who is a passionate kindergarten teacher,
It directly challenges those stereotypes about what's possible for them. Without that visibility, the hidden curriculum just keeps winning.
that visibility also connects to this idea of credentialism. Education prepares you for society, and that diploma is the proof. It's more than paper. It's a recognized qualification that decides where you can go next.
Credentialism is the sociological term for that emphasis we place on formal documents, the diploma, the degree, as the main symbol of knowledge. It's a gatekeeping mechanism.
But something is changing there.
Something huge. In the U.S. now, the gender gap in higher ed has completely flipped. More women now receive bachelor's degrees than men.
And that has the potential to start leveling the playing field in the workplace.
It has to, in terms of representation. Women are now acquiring the foundational certificates they need to enter these professional careers in greater numbers.
Speaking of the workplace, we have to look at the power dynamics inside the school itself. Who is doing the socializing and who holds the power?
This is a classic, persistent sociological paradox. Early and secondary education is a highly gendered profession. About 3/4 of all public school teachers are female.
3/4. But when you look at leadership,
The picture flips dramatically.
Yeah.
Just under 1/4 of all school district superintendents are female.
so students see women in these nurturing teaching roles day in and day out. But when they look to the ultimate decision makers, the people with the real power over policy and budgets, those roles are overwhelmingly held by men.
Correct. And students internalize this through implicit bias. When men are the administrators, they are reinforced as the figures of authority. The female teachers, by contrast, reinforce a gender dynamic of caregiving and sort of subordinate management.
And that sets a tone for what professional roles look like outside of school, too.
Absolutely. And the research suggests this lack of diversity is actually harmful, especially for marginalized students.
How so?
Studies confirm that students of color benefit academically and emotionally when they're taught by teachers of the same race or ethnicity. This effect is especially strong for struggling learners. Seeing a mentor who shares your background is incredibly validating.
But despite that clear evidence, the national teacher population just doesn't reflect the student population.
Not even close. In 2020, over half of all public school students identified as other than white alone. Their teachers, however, remain overwhelmingly white. That mismatch is a powerful, if unintended, part of the hidden curriculum. It teaches diverse students that authority and knowledge primarily reside with the dominant racial group.
Okay, let's zoom out even further and talk about the historical and scientific basis of sex segregation. The beliefs that support all of this are incredibly deep-seated.
Ancient, really. They go back to the 1500s. You have researchers, almost all men, trying to scientifically prove that there are biological differences in mental ability, all to justify women's subordinate status.
The idea being that men's larger size meant larger brains, and therefore more capacity for complex thought.
Exactly. And that women's brains were less developed. For centuries, this was the prevailing, though completely unscientific ideology. It led to these overtly biased yet widely accepted scientific statements.
Like that researcher from the late 1800s, George Romanes.
A celebrated figure at the time. And he claimed, quote, that the judgment of women is inferior to that of men has been a matter of universal recognition from the earliest times. He basically formalized the idea that man was the rightful lord because the woman was the weaker vessel, both mentally and physically.
It's hard to believe that was guiding educational policy less than 150 years ago.
Thankfully, there were early critical voices, like Helen Thompson Woolley.
She was a revolutionary figure.
Absolutely. She got her PhD in psychology in 1900, and she was one of the first researchers to explicitly call out the bias of her male colleagues. She argued that it was societal influence and cultural expectation, not biology, that were driving these gender differences.
So what does modern science say about all this today?
It's been completely debunked, contradicted at every level. Current studies show that early in life, females often outperform males academically and socially, even before school starts.
And what about the big one, the idea that boys are just naturally better at math?
A massive meta-analysis found that males and females perform similarly in math. Even more definitively, modern neuroscience confirms that the brains of all genders use the exact same neural system when they're developing math skills. So the biological basis for a gendered math ability, it's just not there.
So if biology is out, that leads us right to the single-gender school debate. This is a modern intervention trying to fix the societal pressures that create these gaps.
Right. Proponents will argue that segregation is an antidote to those pressures. In an all-girls school, for example, a girl might feel less pressure to conform to the stereotype that she's bad at math.
And in an all-boys school, they might feel freer to express emotion or take an art class?
That's the argument. But historically, of course, single-gender schools were created to reinforce those stereotypes, not fight them.
That's true. Girls were trained for domestic roles, boys for jobs.
Which often created this detrimental dynamic where adult women were left with poor literacy and math skills, making them incredibly vulnerable if their husband died or they divorced.
Okay, so when we look at modern single-gender schools, what do the big studies actually show? Are they effective?
This is a really powerful and, for many, unexpected finding. The results are mixed, but the strong consensus argues against the benefits of segregation.
Really?
A massive review. We're talking 45 years of K-12 studies, 1.66 million people across 21 countries found no benefit to single-sex classrooms.
No benefit in what areas?
Across the board. Performance, attitudes. In math, science, verbal skills, even body image.
Zero measurable academic benefit in K-12. That is a powerful repudiation of the whole idea. How do the schools even respond to that? Don't they say it's about confidence?
That's precisely their counterpoint. They say the intangible benefits, the self-esteem boost, freedom from distraction, justify the model. And there are a couple of specific areas where benefits are consistently shown.
Okay.
Single-gender physical education, for one. It consistently increases perceived self-ability for girls. Without the pressure of competing with or performing in front of boys, they feel more confident.
And what about in higher education?
Research on modern women's colleges does suggest some positive attitudinal benefits. Students report more positive views on gender equality, higher self-esteem, but the detractors still argue that it might impede their ability to work in a diverse, co-ed world later on.
And we can't forget that regardless of how well they work, establishing single-gender public schools is just full of legal challenges because of federal funding laws.
Absolutely. And the historical echo is chilling. Separate but equal historically results in profound inequity. The fear is always that separation, no matter how well-intentioned, reverts to being unequal in resources or quality. So we've been charting how these gendered norms get systematically introduced and reinforced. Now I think we need to pivot to how these biases show up in our current laws and teaching, and then, and this is the most serious part of this segment, we need to talk about the ultimate devastating consequence of this power inequity, the crisis of violence in our schools.
We're seeing these legislative battles play out right now, reflecting these deep cultural divides. Let's look at current legislative and curricular bias.
A really high-profile example is that Florida legislation from 2022, the one often called the Don't Say Gay bill. It severely restricts any classroom conversation about sexual orientation or gender identity from kindergarten through 5th grade.
And the argument from supporters is that those topics are for parents to handle, not schools.
Right. But opponents argue very vehemently that the law negatively impacts the mental health and well-being of LGBTQ+ kids by basically forcing them into a silence that denies their reality.
And public opinion was just split right down the middle, which shows you how deep this goes. A survey found 49% were against it, 40% supported it. This is a real battleground over who gets to define what's normal.
And that battle translates directly into the classroom through teacher bias. Research has found that a math teacher's own gender stereotypes, even subtle ones, can actively widen performance gaps. Their male students end up achieving higher success than their female students.
So even if the textbook is neutral, the teacher's delivery carries the bias.
The delivery and the expectations, it's a fundamental institutional failure. But there are some powerful counter-efforts coming from inside the system. You mentioned that Columbia University example earlier.
Right, that was a positive model.
It really is. Yeah. Medical students there recognized the problem of the hidden curriculum, and they created a formal reporting process to identify and address implicit bias. And because of that student-led effort, they forced significant changes to the curriculum in the first year.
Which proves that organized action can lead to really swift reform.
It can.
We also have to talk about the negative impact of what the sources call non-cis normativity.
Absolutely. When the school environment just assumes that everyone is cisgender, meaning their gender identity matches the sex they were assigned at birth, that's cisnormativity, and it significantly impairs a transgender or non-binary student's ability to learn.
Why does that assumption get in the way of learning?
Because feeling like you're being erased or having your identity invalidated creates this constant state of cognitive and emotional stress. The research is clear that intentionally representing all genders, non-binary, transgender, male, female, from a very early age is vital.
And it helps all children, not just trans children.
It helps all children feel more confident about understanding their own bodies and identities outside of that rigid male-female binary.
Okay, shifting gears now. From pedagogical bias to the ultimate failure of these power dynamics. Violence in educational settings. We know it's prevalent, but getting accurate, centralized data is tricky.
It's very difficult. The data is collected by so many different agencies, it's all fragmented. But one consistent and very concerning finding from the National Institute of Justice is that while overall crime in schools has been decreasing for a while, the horrific trend of multiple victim homicide incidents is actually increasing.
Are there clear gender differences in the kind of violence we see?
Yes, male students report being in physical fights almost 3 times as often as female students. But it's also crucial to see how violence inside the school connects violence outside.
Oh, so?
Studies show that violent girls reported significantly higher levels of fear and personal experience with physical and sexual abuse at home, compared to both boys and nonviolent girls. This suggests that for many female students, violence at school might be a reaction to victimization happening somewhere else.
The nature of violence is also changing so fast, especially with electronic bullying.
A 2021 report showed 16% of high schoolers reported being bullied electronically. But look at the gender split. 25% of females reported it, compared to 19% of males.
And it's even worse for students who identify as gay, lesbian, or bisexual.
They reported the highest rate, at 27%. That intersectional identity of being both female and a sexual minority, it just exponentially increases the risk.
And when we look at the specific motivation behind some of these crimes, we have to talk about hate crimes.
Which are defined as violent crimes based on a person's demographics, race, sexual orientation, gender identity. The data for colleges shows motivations rooted in everything from racial bias to anti-transgender bias. It's a direct assault on a person's identity within the learning environment.
And the federal requirement to even track this data came out of a terrible tragedy, which led to a major policy change.
That's the story of the Clary Act. In 1986, a university student named Jean Clary was raped and murdered in her campus dorm. Her parents' advocacy led to this federal law being passed in 1990.
It requires any college receiving federal money to report campus crimes and safety issues.
Publicly. It didn't just require reporting. It fundamentally changed how universities saw their role. They were forced to become security stewards, not just academic halls. They have to track and release data on everything from sexual assault to stalking, and if they don't, they can lose their federal funding.
Let's move now to the ultimate intersection of all of this, campus rape culture and sexual assault.
The societal context for this is just inescapable. Female bodies are sexualized everywhere, and our popular stories constantly frame women as characters in distress who need to be saved by men. Nationally, the numbers are just devastating. 1 in 6 women has been the victim of an attempted or completed rape.
And on a college campus, that power dynamic is amplified, especially within certain social structures.
That's where researchers like Peggy Reeves Sanday did their work. She studied fraternity culture and found that it provides a kind of socialization that can encourage violent behavior toward women. It's a whole spectrum, from verbal harassment like catcalling all the way to normalizing the drugging and gang raping of women.
And this environment creates a toxic system of victim blaming.
Exactly. The social context gets weaponized against the survivor. Sanday explains this distorted logic where if a young woman is at a party with alcohol, she's seen as asking for it.
Mm.
Society reasons she gets what she deserves because she failed in her, quote, appointed task as the moral regulator of male sexuality.
It's chilling, and the data is clear on who is most vulnerable.
Men are the primary perpetrators, and critically, most rapes are committed by repeating offenders, campus predators who specifically target vulnerable students, like freshmen who are new to the social scene, new to drugs and alcohol.
And when we look at students who fall outside the gender binary, the TGQN students, transgender, genderqueer, or nonconforming, the rates are even more alarming.
They are. 21% of TGQN college students have been sexually assaulted. Compare that to 18% of non-TGQN females and only 4% of non-TGQN males. Having that intersectional identity dramatically increases your vulnerability.
And the institutional response often just makes it worse.
It can compound the harm. You see administrators who overlook or give lighter sentences to male offenders, especially if they're valuable athletes or academics. They see them as just blowing off steam. It sends this powerful message about whose safety is valued and whose isn't.
And victims often delay reporting for days, months, even years.
And then that delay gets weaponized against them, used as a reason to say their accusation is less credible. We also have to highlight the specific layered difficulties that Black women face.
How does that intersectionality affect their experience?
It's a double burden. They often hesitate to report, especially if the offender is a Black man, because they fear contributing to negative stereotypes or disproportionate incarceration rates. Plus, they face negative societal perceptions of themselves as victims, which leads to them using crisis centers and mental health services less often than their white counterparts. The institution has to address not just the crime, but the racialized trauma and fear.
Finally, let's briefly touch on the unique challenges for transgender and LGBTQIA plus youth in K-12 and higher ed.
These students experience significantly higher rates of violence, discrimination, and tragically, suicide risk. In K-12, the harassment rates are off the charts. 77% of trans students who are out or perceived as trans reported at least one major negative experience, being harassed, physically attacked, even expelled.
That rate drops in college, but the daily barriers are still there.
They are. It drops to 24%, which is still way too high. And a majority of transgender students report actively avoiding school bathrooms and locker rooms. These are essential parts of the school. When you have to forego basic biological needs just to feel safe, your ability to learn is severely compromised. It just highlights the desperate need for explicit, comprehensive anti-discrimination policies.
It's so easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this, by the systemic bias and the violence, but our sociological lens lets us see progress when we look across time. Social change is possible. It's often painstakingly slow, but it happens, and it's usually driven by activism.
Looking back, you can really pinpoint these historical victories that paved the way for greater access and equity for so many marginalized groups in education.
One of the biggest was for students with disabilities. Before the mid-70s, many of these students were just denied a public education entirely. Then the 1975 Education for All Handicapped Children Act completely changed that.
And you see the result today. The goal was inclusion, and we're getting there. In the 2018-2019 school year, over 64% of children with disabilities were in general education classrooms for 80% or more of the day. That's a massive institutional shift.
We also see these historical fights against racial barriers. The sources shared some important stories from Oregon universities that show just how recent this kind of exclusion was.
Think about Mabel Bird, the first Black student at the University of Oregon in 1914. She was explicitly banned from living in the dorms because of her race. She had to work as a domestic servant for a professor just to be able to go to school.
Or Carrie Halsell at Oregon State in 1926. Same thing, excluded from campus housing.
But the story of change there is so powerful. In 2002, OSU named a residence hall after Carrie Halsell. And today, Halsell Hall is the only gender-inclusive living space on that campus. That recognition, decades late, shows the lasting impact of challenging those barriers.
But even with these victories, enrollment gaps are still a huge problem.
They persist. The data shows Black or African American students are only 2% of public university students in Oregon, but they're 13.6% of the U.S. population. So the work to close those gaps has to continue.
As student populations get more diverse, the subjects they study have to change too. We're seeing this big transformation in academic disciplines.
It's a direct challenge to that historical curriculum that was created almost exclusively by white, male, heterosexual authorities. It started with women's studies in the 1970s. These programs focused on women's history, their contributions, and analyzing power inequity.
And that field has evolved so much. Now many are called gender and sexuality studies or feminist studies to be more inclusive of all genders and sexualities.
But this is a constant political battle.
Hmm.
The sources note the serious pushback, like the Hungarian Prime Minister removing accreditation for gender studies programs in 2018, with an official calling it an ideology, not a science.
Oh.
It just shows how hard it is to fundamentally challenge traditional academic structures.
Alongside that, queer studies gained traction in the 70s and really took off in the 90s.
Queer studies focuses on that intersection of gender and sexuality, and fundamentally challenges the cis and heteronormative assumptions that create so much inequality. It provides that necessary academic space.
And we've also seen the rise of ethnic and cultural studies, Chicana studies, Latino studies, Black Africana studies. These all emerged in the 60s and 70s as a direct response to a Eurocentric curriculum.
And these fields, which were once seen as niche, are now often required courses or major academic tracks. It's a massive shift. African American Studies now partners with STEM departments, linking the African diaspora to science and technology. It shows how relevant these fields are across all disciplines.
And this change is happening even in kindergarten, with language immersion tracks in Spanish, Chinese, Russian, challenging the dominance of English.
All of this change is ultimately fueled by key movements and policy change. And the most landmark piece of legislation here is Title IX of 1972.
Title IX prohibits sex discrimination in any education program getting federal money. It was absolutely instrumental, especially for opening up sports to women and girls. It literally leveled the playing field.
And we have to pause and acknowledge the champion of that bill, Representative Patsy Takemoto Mink of Hawaii. As the first Asian American woman in Congress, she said she felt this special burden, this dual role. She wasn't just representing her district. She had to voice the concerns of all women in the country.
That kind of commitment is what it takes. And beyond laws, there are these critical anti-violence organizations driving cultural change.
Groups like Reign the Rape, Abuse and Incest National Network, which runs the National Sexual Assault Hotline, and also Men Can Stop Rape, which works to promote healthy, nonviolent masculinity and engage men as allies.
And you have the historical advocacy of Take Back the Night.
It's a global movement, started in the 70s, organizing marches to end sexual violence. It shows that grassroots action is often the catalyst for everything else.
And modern activism is using new platforms. The hashtag #MeToo movement, created by Tarana Burke, used social media to show just how pervasive sexual assault really is.
And at the same time, the hashtag Say Your Name movement works to acknowledge Black women who are victims of police violence, whose deaths are so often underreported. It's a challenge to the media and to our institutions.
And these efforts are global. The UN Girls Education Initiative, Together for Girls. They're all working to close the gender gap and ensure safe learning environments everywhere. This fight is universal. Hashtag tag outro. We have completed a truly comprehensive deep dive. And I think what we've seen is that educational institutions are not neutral. They are fundamental agents of socialization. Through both the formal teaching and that powerful, subtle, hidden curriculum, they shape our entire understanding of gender.
And that understanding dictates everything. The careers we pursue, who holds power, and which students are made most vulnerable to violence.
The central takeaway for me is just the undeniable significance of persistent activist movements, from the courage of students like Mabel Bird to the passage of Title IX to the evolution of queer studies. These movements are crucial. They force institutions to confront their own bias and become more inclusive.
The system only changes when it's forced to look at itself. That's absolutely right.
And that brings us to our final provocative thought for you to continue exploring. We know that for centuries, academic content was created by white, male, heterosexual authorities. This resulted in what we called symbolic annihilation, the systemic erasure of so many other groups. So considering the undeniable trend of increasing diversity in our student populations and the rise of these new self-critical academic fields like queer studies and ethnic studies, what lasting societal structures might be fundamentally undermined once the curriculum, the core tool for transmitting knowledge, achieves true, balanced representation of all genders, all sexualities, and all ethnicities?
If the hidden curriculum finally teaches equality, what does that truly equitable world look like outside the classroom? That's a critical question for the future of education and society at large. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the educational system.